Yep, so today we're starting with chapter 13, looking at specific phobia. And like I said before, the main aim for today is just to go through what is specific phobia, what are the key characteristics or key symptoms of specific phobia, and how is specific phobia different from just normal stress and normal anxiety that someone would experience. And finally, what are the three contributing factors biologically, from a biological point of view, that would increase the risk of someone developing specific phobia. Okay, so we know specific phobia is a mental disorder. And when we class it as a mental disorder, it's actually classified as an anxiety disorder. Okay, and the main reason for that is that the main symptom that people with specific phobia experience is anxiety. They're always anxious that the thing that they're scared of, which we call the phobic stimulus, is around the corner, or it's somewhere, or, you know, they can't even leave the house because they're worried that, you know, if they're scared of seagulls, they're worried that a seagull's going to land on their head. If they're worried about, you know, if they have a phobia of cars, they're worried that a car's going to speed past them when they leave the house. So again, depending on the phobia that you have, that is going to produce a lot of anxiety in you. And that anxiety, to some extent or the other, is going to be causing you to have some level of impairment and dysfunction. Okay, and that's what is different from the anxiety that people with specific phobia experience compared to the anxiety that you or I or anyone who doesn't have a specific phobia might experience. Okay, so remember, we just need to recap these definitions. Stress is another key effect of specific phobia. In fact, people who have specific phobias tend to be stressed a lot of the time, especially if they might be in a circumstance where they have to encounter their phobic stimulus. So if you've got a if you've got a phobia of birds or seagulls, and your family plans this really elaborate trip to some really nice coastal or beach kind of area, you are obviously going to be very stressed because the likelihood of you encountering seagulls in such an area is going to be very high. You're also going to be very anxious. Okay, so this is the definition of stress, the same definition we looked at in chapter 3. And this is the definition of anxiety. And anxiety is just a new definition for us. So I am going to highlight what are the key important elements in it. The first thing we need to remember is that anxiety is a state of physiological arousal, in the sense that it does actually lead to some kind of bodily reaction. Okay, when people are anxious, they tend to feel you know, different reactions or different changes in their body. For example, when I'm anxious, I get like this really weird feeling in my stomach. Some people, you know, get really sweaty palms. Okay, other people feel like they're breathless, that they can't actually speak. Other people, you know, might experience, you know, they might start to shiver. Okay, they might actually get this actual physical, visceral reaction there. Okay, so that's what we say when we say anxiety is a state of physiological arousal. It leads to some kind of bodily change or bodily reaction. Okay, and that's obviously associated with the activation of our sympathetic nervous system. Now, anxiety is a little bit different from stress, because anxiety is this feeling that something is wrong or that something unpleasant will happen, even in the absence of any evidence that suggests that that will happen. So if you have a specific phobia of seagulls, and you don't even want to go to a beach or coastal type area because you're worried about seagulls. Maybe seagulls pose no actual risk or threat to you, but you just have this anxiety, this kind of irrational worry, this irrational uncertainty that something is wrong, or that something will actually happen that will, you know, that will be really bad for you. Okay. These fears are not always, are most of the time unfounded or unwarranted, meaning that there's no real reason for someone to be anxious, but sometimes anxiety does take control of how a person thinks. Okay, so anxiety can occur in the absence of, even in the absence of any threatening stimuli. Stress is a little bit different, because a lot of the time, we don't always get stressed in the absence of a stimuli. Usually it's the presence of some stimuli, or we encounter the actual threat. Okay, we don't actually get anxious with reference to a lot of the things that make us stressed, because we experience stress as a result of an actual known stimuli or known threat. Okay, anxiety, it's different, because you can experience anxiety even in the absence of a threat or the absence of anything that could be harmful. And that is why anxiety is so detrimental for people who experience it, whether you experience normal anxiety to heightened levels compared to other people, or whether you experience it as part of a mental disorder. So it's important for us to differentiate between those two concepts there. Alrighty, when we're looking at differentiating stress and anxiety from what normal stress and anxiety looks like compared to people who have specific phobia looks like, we have to remember that anxiety is defined differently depending on whether you're experiencing it as a normal person who is mentally healthy or as a person who has an actual mental disorder like specific phobia. So like I said before, people who have specific phobia, the kind of anxiety that they experience is a lot more disabling. It's a lot more debilitating. It's a lot more dysfunctional. It causes them to have an actual impairment in their life. Okay, for example, they don't leave the house. They don't go to their best friend's island wedding because they're scared of flying, and they know that to get there, they'd have to hop on an airplane. Okay, that's how disabling or impairing it is for them. Whereas for a normal person who is like otherwise mentally healthy, who doesn't have a mental disorder, a normal experience of anxiety could be, you know, you going up the Eureka Tower and you looking down and you kind of feeling like this little sense of like anxiety, like, oh my God, I'm so high up. Okay, a person who has an actual specific phobia of heights, they wouldn't even make it to the top of the tower. You wouldn't even be able to get them probably onto the actual street in which the Eureka Tower was located, okay, because their mental disorder and the anxiety they feel as a result of that is so debilitating and impairing that you wouldn't even be able to convince them to come to the Eureka Tower in the first place. Okay, so again, normal experiences, anything that would make most people anxious, for example, even public speaking. Even the best public speakers do experience some level of anxiety, you know, before doing a big public speech in front of everyone. But if you're so scared of public speaking and you've got a specific phobia of public speaking that you don't turn up to school for the whole 2 weeks when you guys are doing the oral presentation assessment, well, then that is a whole other level of anxiety there, and that could be indicative of a specific phobia. Okay, so just remember the main way we differentiate between stress and anxiety in normal experiences and in specific phobia is that the stress and anxiety in specific phobia shows some kind of level of impairment and dysfunction. It stops the person from living their daily life in a normal way. It stops them from, for example, going to a friend's wedding. It stops them from getting a nice job because they have to be located really high up on the 10th floor. It stops them from exercising in the park because they're worried that a dog is going to jump on them. It stops them from going to the doctor because they're scared of needles. Okay, so all of these things are debilitating and disabling and impairing that person's ability to function as a normal human being. And that's why, as with any other mental disorder, specific phobia is indicative of that dysfunction and that impairment. Okay, so now that you understand how much, or generally how much specific phobia can impact a person's life in terms of causing impairment and dysfunction, it's important for us to now obviously look at the definition of specific phobia and what you really need to know about the whole definition and what are the key words of it. So when we look at the definition of specific phobia is a mental disorder, that's obviously important, characterized by significant anxiety. Anxiety is the main symptom or effect or behavior that's actually shown by people who have specific phobia, which is provoked. So that anxiety doesn't just happen out of nowhere. It's usually provoked by some exposure to a feared stimulus. Okay, and we call this feared stimulus the where can I write this? We call it the phobic stimulus. So if I can somehow write phobic here. Okay, another word for the feared stimulus, or the thing that the patient actually is scared of, is the phobic stimulus. Okay, and the kind of experience of fear that people with specific phobia have is very different to a normal experience of fear, because the fear they experience is very intense and it's very irrational. Okay, sometimes they are scared of things that just seem unreasonable. Okay, the word irrational means unreasonable. So they're scared of things that you would be like, why are you so scared of coming to the beach? It's not like a seagull's gonna chop your head off and, you know, gnaw your eyes out. But for them, for the actual specific phobia patient, they believe that yes, a seagull, as soon as I step onto the beach, a seagull is gonna come towards me and literally bite my eyes out. Like, they actually see that as a legitimate reasoning, okay? But for everyone else, that just sounds irrational. And because they're so scared of this phobic stimulus, they often engage in avoidance behavior, which is they don't leave the house if it means they have to go to the beach. If the school is going on an excursion to Eureka Tower, they will probably make an excuse to stay home because they're scared of heights. Okay, all of these different things I've underlined have to continue for at least 6 months in order for us to have a diagnosis, a clinical diagnosis of specific phobia. Okay, so like I said before, the specific object, event, or situation that causes the fear response is known as the phobic stimulus. That's just the thing that creates or produces that fear response in the patient suffering from specific phobia. Okay, so that is basically the definition of specific phobia. Now, there's a big list of phobias in your book. You don't need to know all of them, obviously. Some phobias we're already quite familiar with. For example, phobias like claustrophobia. Most of us have heard of that word before. It's the fear of closed spaces or cramped spaces. You know, arachnophobia. Arachnophobia is very popular in like movies and TV shows, and it's like the fear of spiders. Okay, you've got so many other phobias as well, but you don't need to know each of these or like 10 or 20 examples. Just know maybe at least 2 examples just for the purpose of knowing them, but you won't be asked about specific phobias. So you won't be asked about a specific phobia in the actual SACWA exam. So you won't be asked to, for example, define what is meant by arachnophobia. You'll probably be asked to define specific phobia, which is this first dot point definition here, but you won't be asked to actually in detail explain what a specific example of a specific phobia is. Okay, so just for your own knowledge, maybe just know like 2 names of specific phobias, but in general, it's more important for us to know it as an overall topic rather than looking at the individual examples. Okay, so what are the key features or characteristics? And we've kind of gone through this in the previous slide. This is kind of just looking at what are the key features or characteristics of someone who has specific phobia. Okay, a lot of the time, a lot of these little circles here are referring to the kind of the symptoms or the behaviors that we see in people who have specific phobia to begin with. So number 1, we know that they show an irrational fear. Irrational fear means that the fear response that they show towards the phobic stimulus is unreasonable. It seems like it's really out of reason. It seems like they shouldn't be this scared of a tiny spider that's on the other side of the room when, you know, they are much bigger than the spider. So, you know, the age-old saying that, you know, you're more scared of, it's more scared of you than you are of it. So like, they don't understand that. They think that that spider is actually going to probably kill them or cause them to, you know, cause them some significant, considerable harm there. So it's irrational. The fear is also intense. It's so intense that the person goes to the extent of actually avoiding the phobic stimulus. And this obviously then causes impairment, because if they're avoiding the phobic stimulus, for example, fear of heights or something, they might not go on a school excursion. They might miss out on that experience, and it's impairing their daily functioning. It leads to dysfunction again, because obviously the patient is showing those avoidance behaviors, not going out to a friend's wedding because it's on a beach, not going out on a school excursion because it's in the city where there's a lot of skyscrapers and they're scared of heights. The fear response to the phobic stimulus is conditioned or learned. So some of you are probably like, oh my God, is that classical conditioning again? Yes, it is classical conditioning again. The main way in which phobias are developed is through classical conditioning, is through a repeated association between stimuli, which is originally neutral, and eventually that stimuli begins to be associated with the dreadful or the fearful event, and then it obviously becomes a conditioned stimulus or a phobic stimulus. In fact, another word for phobic stimulus, or the way we link phobic stimulus to classical conditioning, is that we actually call it the conditioned stimulus. It's the stimulus that you have learned to fear. You haven't been born with the phobia, but it has developed in you. And like we said before, obviously, the significant anxiety with reference to the phobia continues for at least 6 months. That is the diagnostic criteria. So if you've experienced all these kind of symptoms and you go to a psychologist, they ask you, how long have you been experiencing this for? And if you say at least 6 months or 7 or 8 months, then that is enough for them to officially diagnose you with specific phobia, and then move on to obviously prescribing treatments or interventions for that. Okay, so that is obviously some key features or characteristics. So now that we've looked at the key features, characteristics, we've looked at the definition of specific phobia, we've got to move on to now looking at 3 biological contributing factors. Now, we call these biological contributing factors because all of these biological contributing factors are in some way or the other either related to our body, our bodily functioning or bodily reactions, or they're related to our brain in terms of like how our brain functions, how our brain stores information, okay? Or like the role of neurotransmitters or hormones and that kind of stuff. So that's why these are the biological contributing factors. And the 3 that we're looking at today are the role of GABA. So the role of GABA dysfunction, which is gamma aminobutyric acid. We all know what this neurotransmitter is from chapter 2. The role of LTP, we did LTP a lot in outcome 2 of unit 3, so we all know what this is as well. And the role of the stress response, which we did obviously in chapter 3. So none of this is new information. It's just a matter of taking what we know about these 3 concepts and relating it back to phobia. So let's just have a look at that and just do that now. So the first one is gamma aminobutyric acid dysfunction. So when people have a dysfunction in this neurotransmitter called GABA, they tend to be at a higher risk of developing specific phobia. And I'll explain to you why this is. Now, remember that when we talked about neurotransmitters in chapter 2, we looked at 2 types of neurotransmitters. We looked at glutamate, which are the little, we'll call them like the little black marbles. That's how they're represented. The little black marbles there are glutamate. Okay, so glutamate is obviously an excitatory neurotransmitter. Yeah, excitatory means that it is stimulating neural activity. It's promoting neural activity and neural firing. GABA, on the other hand, we said was an example of an inhibitory neurotransmitter. Inhibitory means that it stops neural activity, it prevents neural activity, it basically depresses that neural activity. Okay, so we have to think about specific phobia patients and the kind of thought processes that go through their head on a daily basis. Now, if you're someone who is in a normal physiological, they should say normal. So if you're someone who's in a normal physiological state where you don't have any anxiety disorders such as specific phobia, generally what happens is there tends to be a balance here. So you can see that both of the scales in this little picture that I'm referring to now are balanced, okay? So your GABA and your glutamate are balanced. It's not like you've got more of glutamate or less of GABA, you've got the same amount. This is normal and this will generally lead to a normal or relatively normal mental functioning. What happens in anxiety disorders such as specific phobia is that there is an imbalance of neurotransmitters, okay? So specifically, you've got more of glutamate, which are the black marbles, and less of GABA. And remember that glutamate is the neurotransmitter involved. It's the neurotransmitter that's released, the excitatory neurotransmitter that's released when we think a lot, when we learn a lot of information. It's everything to do with learning, thinking, memory. Glutamate is released. GABA is the neurotransmitter that's released to kind of regulate or balance out that thinking, to make sure that we don't overthink, to put a stop to that neural activity, to put a stop to the sending of those neural messages and that excessive neural communication. Now, in patients with anxiety disorders like specific phobia, if I have a specific phobia of spiders and I'm just standing on the other side of the room and I see a thread on the floor, or someone's, I just see a bit of thread, or like it's a little toy or something that looks like a spider on the other side of the room, even before walking up to that and confirming whether it is an actual real spider, my brain starts to go into overdrive. So I start to overthink. I start to be like, oh my God, is that a spider? Oh my God, is it going to come to me? Oh my God, I wonder if it's a tarantula or a redback or a black widow. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. So there's like so much overthinking that's happening in my brain. My neural activity is literally in overdrive. Okay, and when you've got this much neural activity, when you've got all these neural pathways getting activated, all these neurons communicating with one another, which leads to you, or which is indicative of you overthinking that situation, overanalyzing that situation, obviously you're then going to have a lot of GABA, okay? And that GABA is going to outweigh you're going to have a lot of glutamate, and that glutamate is going to outweigh your, oh my God, what have I done? Oops, hold on. I've accidentally done something stupid and I need to get out of this. Okay, it's just blocking my screen, I think. Anyway, so yeah, when you've got your glutamate obviously being released in excessive amounts, that is reflecting the kind of overthinking that you are going through when you see a phobic stimulus or when you see something that is potentially threatening to you or your environment. Okay, so essentially that is what GABA dysfunction means. When you don't have enough GABA to balance out that excessive glutamate production or glutamate release, then you are going to be at a higher risk of developing specific phobia because you don't have the GABA, which is the inhibitory neurotransmitter, which is meant to be counteracting or going against or balancing out the activity of glutamate. Okay, so obviously that overthinking just continues to get out of control. It continues to happen excessively in the patient. Okay, so in summary, if we look at this little purple box here, the inhibitory action of GABA, which is our red traffic light, counteracts the excitatory action of glutamate, which is obviously our green traffic light, which is in overdrive in specific phobia patients. So essentially what that means is that these people are going to continue to overthink, continue to put their brains into overdrive, thinking about that phobic stimulus, overthinking, and essentially that's going to lead to more anxiety. The more you think about the phobic stimulus, the more anxious you're going to become. So it really does nothing. When you've got a GABA dysfunction, it really does nothing to help you as a patient. It just makes your situation really worse. Okay, so remember GABA dysfunction means that GABA doesn't work properly. And so essentially, when GABA doesn't work properly, you are likely to develop an anxiety disorder such as specific phobia. It's just a matter of knowing the function of each and understanding what a patient with specific phobias thought processes kind of looks like. Alrighty, the next biological factor that we're going through is the role of the stress response. So we have to remember that when a patient has a specific phobia, it generally tends to activate a stress response in them, and that this stress response is often underlined by the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system generally leads to a response called the fight-flight response, and the fight-flight response we know is associated, just as the sympathetic nervous system is associated, with a range of responses. So a patient who sees a spider and they have arachnophobia or a specific phobia of spiders are going to have an increased heart rate. Their heart's going to feel like it's beating out of their chest. They're going to feel breathless. They're going to feel like they're either breathing really rapidly or, they're not able to control their breathing rate. Adrenal hormones, so adrenaline is released into the bloodstream, which leads to that adrenaline rush, okay, which makes them either confront the stressor or in most cases run away. Now we have to remember that if you've ever had a phobia or some resemblance of what a phobia is, you would basically understand that phobias are quite physiologically charged reactions. And so when you've got a fear reaction or a phobic reaction, you tend to experience you can feel your heart beating out of your chest. You can feel like you're sweating a lot, like you're getting really you're burning up. You can feel like you're suddenly lightheaded or dizzy. You feel like you're about to faint. And so these physiological processes that are actually within the body start to affect how you feel psychologically as well. So as your body starts to burn up, you start to feel more stressed. You feel like you can't calm yourself down at that point. And that, again, exacerbates or contributes to a worsening of the stress response. Okay, so essentially how the reactions or the bodily reactions you experience from a phobic stimulus lead to your stress response elevating or becoming higher in intensity. That's what this slide is about. Okay, and the last biological contributing factor we're looking at is the role of LTP, and this is very similar to the first thing that we looked at with the role of GABA dysfunction. The role of LTP suggests that obviously when you've got a patient with specific phobia, they're constantly thinking about their phobic stimulus, thinking about, when they walk into a new room, is there any spiders around? When they walk into a new area, are there any birds around or any magpies or any seagulls or whatever the bird they're scared of? When they're going on a school excursion, they think, okay, am I going to an area that could be really cramped or really like a closed space if they've got claustrophobia? Or am I going, near skyscrapers that are very high that might make me feel anxious, that might lead to a panic attack? So they're constantly thinking about their phobic stimulus. In fact, they're not just thinking, they're overthinking. Okay, they're overthinking, they're overanalyzing. And essentially, when you overthink, the more you think, the more LTP occurs, okay? Because the more the neural connections, the pre and postsynaptic neurons are forming that connection, and they're constantly communicating with each other and connecting, okay? So obviously, in some instances, like when you're studying for a SAC, LTP is good. For people with specific phobia, LTP is bad because it strengthens the neural connections that are associated with their thoughts about the phobic stimulus, and that's not a good thing. So essentially, yes, you're right. So the previous topic that we looked at in chapter, I think it was chapter, I can't even remember, chapter 6. Yeah, chapter 6 was basically, talking about this idea of consolidation of emotionally arousing experiences, and anxiety did play a big role in that as well. So you're right. That is very much connected to this idea as well. When we're looking at long-term potentiation, obviously each time the patient thinks a negative thought about the phobic stimulus, those thoughts get consolidated and strengthened each time they revisit or revise or recap those same thoughts. So if they're walking into a room and every time they walk into a new room, they're looking around on the walls, they're looking up the ceiling, they're looking at the floor, trying to see if there's any even remotely close appearance to what could be a spider, that is obviously going to strengthen the LTP because of repeated stimulation of the pre and postsynaptic neurons. Okay, and they're constantly connecting with each other. They're constantly becoming familiar with each other. Okay, like I said, when you're studying for a SAC, this is awesome. LTP works in your favor because it obviously helps you to remember information better. But when you are having a phobia, it's not good because LTP is what doesn't allow you to forget your phobic stimulus. It's what doesn't allow you to, lose the memory of what your phobic stimulus is about. And the more you think about that phobic stimulus and the traumatic memory that led to you developing that phobia. So if you have a phobia of a dog, you keep thinking about the time when you were chased by a dog, that memory continues to be consolidated and then reconsolidated and then strengthened and re-strengthened, okay, through the process of LTP or long-term potentiation. So that is essentially why LTP, although it's normally a good thing for our learning, can be a risk factor and a biological contributing factor, which increases the development or increases the risk of developing specific phobia, okay? So that's essentially the third and final biological contributing factor that we're looking at for today. Yeah, so I'm just going to stop the recording here.